The Sacrifice. Limuson was a religious man, though of what depth and quality were unknown, since no trial of ultimate severity had yet tested him. An adherent of no particular creed, he yet had his gods, and his self-discipline was probably more rigorous than his friends conjectured. He was so reserved, few guessed perhaps the desires conquered, the passions regulated, the inner tendencies trained and schooled, not by denying their expression, but by transmuting them alchemically into nobler channels. He had in him the makings of an enthusiastic devotee, and might have become such but for two limitations that prevented. He loved his wealth, laboring to increase it to the neglect of other interests. And secondly, instead of following up one steady line of search, he scattered himself upon many picturesque theories, like an actor who wants to play all parts rather than concentrate on one. And the more picturesque the part, the more he was attracted. Thus, though he did his duty unshrinkingly and with a touch of love, he accused himself sometimes of merely gratifying a sensuous taste in spiritual sensations. There was this unbalance in him that argued want of depth. As for his gods, in the end he discovered their reality by first doubting, then denying their existence. It was this denial and doubt that restored them to their thrones, converting his dilettante skirmishes into genuine deep belief, and the proof came to him one summer in early June when he was making ready to leave town for his annual month among the mountains. With Limuson, mountains, in some inexplicable sense, were a passion almost, and climbing so deep a pleasure that the ordinary scrambler hardly understood it. Grave as a kind of worship it was to him, the preparations for an ascent, the ascent itself in particular, involved a concentration that seemed symbolical as of a ritual. He not only loved the heights, the massive grandeur, the splendor of vast proportions blocked in space, but loved them with a respect that held a touch of awe. The emotion mountains stirred in him, one might say, was of that profound, incalculable kind that held kinship with his religious feelings, half-realized though these were. His gods had their invisible thrones somewhere among the grim, forbidding heights. He prepared himself for this annual mountaineering with the same earnestness that a holy man might approach a solemn festival of his church. And the impetus of his mind was running with big momentum in this direction, when there fell upon him, almost on the eve of starting, a swift series of disasters that shook his being to its last foundations, and left him stunned among the ruins. To describe these is unnecessary. People said, "One thing after another like that, what appalling luck, poor wretch," then wondered, with the curiosity of children, how in the world he would take it. Due to no apparent fault of his own, these disasters were so sudden that life seemed in a moment shattered, and his interest in existence almost ceased. People shook their heads and thought of the emergency exit, but Limuson was too vital a man to dream of annihilation. Upon him it had a different effect. He turned and questioned what he called his gods. They did not answer or explain. For the first time in his life he doubted. A hair's breadth beyond lay definite denial. The ruin in which he sat, however, was not material. No man of his age, possessed of courage and a working scheme of life, would permit disaster of a material order to overwhelm him. It was collapse of a mental, spiritual kind, an assault upon the roots of character and temperament. Moral duties lay suddenly upon him, threatened to crush. His personal existence was assailed, and apparently must end. He must spend the remainder of his life caring for others who were nothing to him. No outlet showed, no way of escape. So diabolically complete was the combination of events that rushed his inner trenches. His faith was shaken. A man can but endure so much and remain human. For him the saturation point seemed reached. He experienced the spiritual equivalent of that physical numbness which supervenes when pain has touched the limit of endurance. He laughed, grew callous, then mocked his silent gods. It is said that upon this state of blank negation there follows sometimes a condition of lucidity which mirrors with crystal clearness the forces driving behind life at a given moment. A kind of clairvoyance that brings explanation and therefore peace. Limuson looked for this in vain. There was the doubt that questioned. There was the sneer that mocked the silence into which his questions fell. But there was neither answer nor explanation, and certainly not peace. there was no relief. In this tumult of revolt he did none of the things his friends suggested or expected. He merely followed the line of least resistance. He yielded to the impetus that was upon him when the catastrophe came. To their indignant amazement, he went out to his mountains. All marveled that at such a time he could adopt so trivial a line of action. Neglecting duties that seemed paramount, they disapproved. Yet in reality he was taking no definite action at all, but merely drifting with the momentum that had been acquired just before. He was bewildered with so much pain, confused with suffering, stunned with the crash that flung him helpless amid undeserved calamity. He turned to the mountains as a child to its mother, instinctively. Mountains had never failed to bring him consolation, comfort, peace. The grandeur restored proportion whenever disorder threatened life. No calculation, properly speaking, was in his move at all, but a blind desire for a violent physical reaction such as climbing brings. And the instinct was more wholesome than he knew. In the high upland valley among lonely peaks whither Lemuson then went, he found in some measure the proportion he had lost. He studiously avoided thinking. He lived in his muscles recklessly. The region with its little inn was familiar to him. Peak after peak he attacked, sometimes with, but more often without, a guide, until his reputation as a sane climber, a laureled member of all the foreign alpine clubs, was seriously in danger. That he overdid it physically is beyond question, but that the mountains breathed into him some portion of their enormous calm and deep endurance is also true. His gods, meanwhile, he neglected utterly for the first time in his life. If he thought of them at all, it was as tinsel figures imagination had created. Figures upon a stage that merely decorated life for those whom pretty pictures pleased. Only, he had left the theater, and their make-believe no longer hypnotized his mind. He realized their impotence and disowned them. This attitude, however, was subconscious. He lent to it no substance, either of thought or speech. He ignored rather than challenged their existence. And it was somewhat in this frame of mind, thinking little, feeling even less, that he came out into the hotel vestibule after dinner one evening and took mechanically the bundle of letters the porter handed to him. They had no possible interest for him. In a corner where the big steam heater mitigated the chilliness of the hall, he idly sorted them. The score or so of other guests, chiefly expert climbing men, were trailing out in twos and threes from the dining room, but he felt as little interest in them as in his letters. No conversation could alter facts. No written phrases change his circumstances. At random, then, he opened a business letter with a typewritten address. It would probably be impersonal, less of a mockery, therefore, than the others with their tiresome sham condolences. And, in a sense, it was impersonal. Sympathy from a solicitor's office is mere formula, a few extra ticks upon the universal keyboard of a Remington. But as he read it, Limuson made a discovery that startled him into acute and bitter sensation. He had imagined the limit of bearable suffering and disaster already reached. Now, in a few dozen words, his error was proved convincingly. The fresh blow was dislocating. This culminating news of additional catastrophe disclosed within him entirely new reaches of pain, of biting, resentful fury. Limuson experienced a momentary stopping of the heart as he took it in, a dizziness, a violent sensation of revolt whose impotence induced almost physical nausea. He felt like death. "Must I suffer all things?" flashed through his arrested intelligence in letters of fire. There was a sullen rage in him, a dazed bewilderment, but no positive suffering as yet. His emotion was too sickening to include the smaller pains of disappointment. It was primitive, blind anger that he knew. He read the letter calmly, even to the neat paragraph of machine-made sympathy at the last, then placed it in his inner pocket. No outward sign of disturbance was upon him. His breath came slowly. He reached over to the table for a match, holding it at arm's length lest the sulfur fumes should sting his nostrils. And in that moment he made his second discovery. The fact that further suffering was still possible included also the fact that some touch of resignation had been left in him, and therefore some vestige of belief as well. Now, as he felt the crackling sheet of stiff paper in his pocket, watched the sulfur die, and saw the wood ignite, this remnant faded utterly away. Like the blackened end of a match, it shriveled and dropped off, It vanished, savagely, yet with an external calmness that enabled him to light his pipe with untrembling hand. He addressed his futile deities. And once more in fiery letters there flashed across the darkness of his passionate thought. Even this you demand of me, this cruel ultimate sacrifice. And he rejected them, bag and baggage, for they were a mockery and a lie. With contempt he repudiated them forever. The stage of doubt had passed. He denied his gods, yet with a smile upon his lips. For what were they, after all, but the puppets his religious fancy had imagined? They never had existed. Was it then merely the picturesque sensational aspect of his devotional temperament that had created them? That side of his nature, in any case, was dead now, killed by a single devastating blow. The gods went with it. Surveying what remained of his life, it seemed to him like a city that an earthquake had reduced to ruins. The inhabitants think no worse thing could happen. Then comes the fire. Two lines of thought, it seems, then developed parallel in him, and simultaneously. For while underneath he stormed against this culminating blow, his upper mind dealt calmly with the project of a great expedition he would make at dawn. He had engaged no guide. As an experienced mountaineer, he knew the district well. His name was tolerably familiar, and in half an hour he could have settled all details, and retired to bed with instructions to be called at 2. But instead he sat there waiting, unable to stir, a human volcano that any moment might break forth into violence. He smoked his pipe as quietly as though nothing had happened, while through the blazing depths of him ran ever this one self-repeating statement, "Even this you demand of me, this cruel ultimate sacrifice." His self-control, dynamically estimated, just then must have been very great, and, thus repressed, the store of potential energy accumulated enormously. With thought concentrated largely upon this final blow, Limuson had not noticed the people who streamed out of the salle à manger, and scattered themselves in groups about the hall. Some individual, now and again, approached his chair with the idea of conversation, then, seeing his absorption, turned away. Even when a climber whom he slightly knew reached across him with a word of apology for the matches, Limuson made no response, for he did not see him. He noticed nothing. In particular, he did not notice two men who, from an opposite corner, had for some time been observing him. He now looked up, by chance, and was vaguely aware that they were discussing him. He met their eyes across the hall and started. For at first he thought he knew them. Possibly he had seen them about in the hotel. They seemed familiar. Yet he certainly had never spoken with them. Aware of his mistake, he turned his glance elsewhere, though still vividly conscious of their attention. One was a clergyman or a priest. His face wore an air of gravity touched by sadness, a sternness about the lips counteracted by a kindling beauty in the eyes that betrayed enthusiasm nobly regulated. There was a suggestion of stateliness in the man that made the impression very sharp. His clothing emphasized it. He wore a dark tweed suit that was strict in its simplicity. There was an austerity in him somewhere. His companion, perhaps by contrast, seemed inconsiderable in his conventional evening dress. A good deal younger than his friend, his hair, always a telltale detail, was a trifle long. The thin fingers that flourished a cigarette wore rings. The face, though picturesque, was flippant, and his entire attitude conveyed a certain insignificance. Gesture, that faultless language which challenges counterfeit, betrayed unbalance somewhere. The impression he produced, however, was shadowy compared to the sharpness of the other. Theatrical was the word in Lemuson's mind, as he turned his glance elsewhere. But as he looked away, he fidgeted. The interior darkness caused by the dreadful letter rose about him. It engulfed him. Dizziness came with it. Far away the blackness was fringed with light, and through this light, stepping with speed and carelessness as from gigantic distance, the two men suddenly grown large came at him. Limuson, in self-protection, turned to meet them. Conversation he did not desire. Somehow he had expected this attack. Yet the instant they began to speak, it was the priest who opened fire. It was all so natural and easy that he almost welcomed the diversion. A phrase by way of introduction, and he was speaking of the summits. Something in Limuson's mind turned over. The man was a serious climber, one of his own species. The sufferer felt a certain relief as he heard the invitation and realized, though dully, the compliment involved.
"If you felt inclined to join us, if you would honor us with your company," the man was saying quietly, adding something then about your great experience and invaluable advice and judgment.
Lemuson looked up, trying hard to concentrate and understand. "The Tour de Néant?" he repeated, mentioning the peak proposed. Rarely attempted, never conquered, and with an ominous record of disaster, it happened to be the very summit he had meant to attack himself next day. "You have engaged guides?" He knew the question foolish.
"No guide will try it," the priest answered, smiling, while his companion added with a flourish, "But we need no guide if you will come." "You are unattached, I believe? You are alone?" the priest inquired, moving a little in front of his friend as though to keep him in the background.
"Yes," replied Limuson. "I am quite alone." He was listening attentively, but with only part of his mind. He realized the flattery of the invitation, yet it was like flattery addressed to someone else. He felt himself so indifferent, so dead. These men wanted his skillful body, his experienced mind, and it was his body and mind that talked with them, and finally agreed to go. Many a time expeditions had been planned in just this way, but tonight he felt there was a difference. Mind and body signed the agreement, but his soul, listening elsewhere and looking on, was silent. With his rejected gods it had left him, though hovering close still. It did not interfere. It did not warn. It even approved. It sang to him from great distance that this expedition cloaked another. He was bewildered by the clashing of his higher and his lower mind.
"At 1 in the morning, then, if that will suit you," the older man concluded.
"I'll see to the provisions," exclaimed the younger enthusiastically, "and I shall take my telephoto for the summit. The porters can come as far as the great tower. We're over 6,000 feet here already, you see, so—" and his voice died away in the distance as his companion led him off.
Lemuson saw him go with relief, but for the other man he would have declined the invitation. At heart he was indifferent enough. What decided him really was the coincidence that the Tour de Néant was the very peak he had intended to attack himself alone, and the curious feeling that this expedition cloaked another somehow. Almost that these men had a hidden motive. But he dismissed the idea. It was not worth thinking about. A moment later he followed them to bed. So careless was he of the affairs of the world, so dead to mundane interests, that he tore up his other letters and tossed them into a corner of the room, unread. 2. Once in his chilly bedroom he realized that his upper mind had permitted him to do a foolish thing. He had drifted like a schoolboy into an unwise situation. He had pledged himself to an expedition with two strangers, an expedition for which normally he would have chosen his companions with the utmost caution. Moreover, he was guide. They looked to him for safety, while yet it was they who had arranged and planned it. But who were these men with whom he proposed to run grave bodily risks? He knew them as little as they knew him. Whence came, he wondered, the curious idea that this climb was really planned by another, who was no one of them? The thought slipped idly across his mind. Going out by one door, it came back, however, quickly by another. He did not think about it more than to note its passage through the disorder that passed with him just then for thinking. Indeed, there was nothing in the whole world for which he cared a single brass farthing. As he undressed for bed, he said to himself, "I shall be called at 1, but why am I going with these two people on this wild plan? And who made the plan?" It seemed to have settled itself. It came about so naturally and easily, so quickly. He probed no deeper. He didn't care. And for the first time he omitted the little ritual, half prayer, half adoration. It had always been his custom to offer his deities upon retiring to rest. He no longer recognized them. How utterly broken his life was. How blank and terrible and lonely. He felt cold and piled his overcoats upon the bed, as though his mental isolation involved a physical effect as well. Switching off the light by the door, he was in the act of crossing the floor in the darkness when a sound beneath the window caught his ear. Outside there were voices talking. The roar of falling water made them indistinct, yet he was sure they were voices, and that one of them he knew. He stopped still to listen. He heard his own name uttered. John Limuson. They ceased. He stood a moment shivering on the boards, then crawled into bed beneath the heavy clothing. But in the act of settling down, they began again. He raised himself again hurriedly to listen. What little wind there was passed in that moment down the valley, carrying off the roar of falling water. And into the moment's space of silence dropped fragments of definite sentences.
"They are close, you say? Close down upon the world?"
It was the voice of the priest, surely.
"For days they have been passing,"
was the answer, a rough, deep tone that might have been a peasant's, and a kind of fear in it.
"For all my flocks are scattered."
"The signs are sure? You know them?"
"Tumult,"
was the answer in much lower tones.
"There has been tumult in the mountains."
There was a break then, as though the voices sank too low to be heard. 2 broken fragments came next. End of a question, beginning of an answer.
"The opportunity of a lifetime. If he goes of his own free will, success is sure, for acceptances."
And the wind, returning, bore back the sound of the falling water, so that Limuson heard no more. An indefinable emotion stirred in him as he turned over to sleep. He stuffed his ears lest he should hear more. He was aware of a sinking of the heart that was inexplicable. What in the world were they talking about, these two? What was the meaning of these disjointed phrases? There lay behind them a grave significance almost solemn. That tumult in the mountains was somehow ominous, its suggestion terrible and mighty. He felt disturbed, uncomfortable, the first emotion that had stirred in him for days. The numbness melted before its faint awakening. Conscience was in it. He felt vague prickings, but it was deeper far than conscience. Somewhere out of sight, in a region life had as yet not plumbed. The words sank down and vibrated like pedal notes. They rumbled away into the night of undecipherable things, and though explanation failed him, he felt they had reference somehow to the morrow's expedition. How, what, wherefore, he knew not. His name had been spoken, then these curious sentences. That was all. Yet, tomorrow's expedition, what was it but an expedition of impersonal kind, not even planned by himself, merely his own plan taken and altered by others, made over. His personal business, his personal life, were not really in it at all. The thought startled him a moment. He had no personal life. Struggling with sleep, his brain played the endless game of disentanglement without winning a single point, while the undermined in him looked on and smiled, because it knew. Then suddenly a great peace fell over him. Exhaustion brought it, perhaps. He fell asleep, and next moment it seemed he was aware of a thundering at the door, and an unwelcome growling voice.
"Ist bald ein Herr Osten."
Rising at such an hour, unless the heart be in it, is a sordid and depressing business. Limuson dressed without enthusiasm, conscious that thought and feeling were exactly where he had left them on going to sleep. The same confusion and bewilderment were in him, also the same deep, solemn emotion stirred by the whispering voices. Only long habit enabled him to attend to detail, and ensured that nothing was forgotten. He felt heavy and oppressed, a kind of anxiety about him. The routine of preparation he followed gravely, utterly untouched by the customary joy. It was mechanical, yet through it ran the old familiar sense of ritual. Due to the practice of so many years, that cleansing of mind and body for a big ascent, like initiatory rites that once had been as important to him as those of some priest who approached the worship of his deity in the temples of ancient time. He performed the ceremony with the same care as though no ghost of vanished faith still watched him, beckoning from the air as formerly. His knapsack carefully packed, he took his ice axe from beside the bed, turned out the light, and went down the creaking wooden stairs in stockinged feet, lest his heavy boots should waken the other sleepers. And in his head still rang the phrase he had fallen asleep on, as though just uttered. "The signs are sure. For days they have been passing, close down upon the world. The flocks are scattered. There has been tumult. Tumult in the mountains." The other fragments he had forgotten. But who were they? And why did the word bring a chill of awe into his blood? And as the words rolled through him, Lemuson felt tumult in his thoughts and feelings too. There had been tumult in his life, and all his joys were scattered. joys that hitherto had fed his days. The signs were sure. Something was close down upon his little world, passing, sweeping. He felt a touch of terror. Outside in the fresh darkness of very early morning, the strangers stood waiting for him. Rather, they seemed to arrive in the same instant as himself, equally punctual. The clock in the church tower sounded 1. They exchanged low greetings, remarked that the weather promised to hold good, and started off in single file over soaking meadows towards the first belt of forest. The porter, mere peasant, unfamiliar of face and not connected with the hotel, led the way with a hurricane lantern. The air was marvelously sweet and fragrant. In the sky overhead the stars shone in their thousands. Only the noise of falling water from the heights and the regular thud of their heavy boots broke the stillness. And black against the sky towered the enormous pyramid of the Tour du Néant they meant to conquer. Perhaps the most delightful portion of a big ascent is the beginning in the scented darkness, while the thrill of possible conquest lies still far off. The hours stretched themselves queerly. Last night's sunset might be days ago. Sunrise and the brilliance coming seemed in another week. Part of dim futurity, like children's holidays. It is difficult to realize that this biting cold before the dawn and the blazing heat to come both belong to the same today. There were no sounds as they toiled slowly up the zigzag path through the first 1,500 of pine woods. No one spoke. The clink of nails and ice-axe points against the stones was all they heard. For the roar of water was felt rather than heard. It beat against the ears and the skin of the whole body at once. The deeper notes were below them now in the sleeping valley. The shriller ones sounded far above, where streams just born out of ponderous snowbeds tinkled sharply. The change came delicately. The stars turned a shade less brilliant, a softness in them as of human eyes that say farewell. Between the highest branches the sky grew visible. A sighing air smoothed all their crests one way. Moss, earth, and open spaces brought keen perfumes, and the little human procession, leaving the forest, stepped out into the vastness of the world above the tree line. They paused while the porter stooped to put his lantern out, and the eastern sky was color. The peaks and crags rushed closer. Was it the dawn? Lemuson turned his eyes from the height of sky, where the summits pierced a path for the coming day, to the faces of his companions, pale and wan in the early twilight. How small, how insignificant they seemed amid this hungry emptiness of desolation. The stupendous cliffs fled past them, led by headstrong peaks crowned with eternal snows. Thin lines of cloud trailing halfway up precipice and ridge seemed like the swish of movement, as though he caught the earth turning as she raced through space. The 4 of them, timid riders on the gigantic saddle, clung for their lives against her Titan ribs, while currents of some majestic life swept up at them from every side. He drew deep draughts of the rarefied air into his lungs. It was very cold. Avoiding the pallid, insignificant faces of his companions, he pretended interest in the porter's operations. He stared fixedly on the ground. It seemed 20 minutes before the flame was extinguished, and the lantern fastened to the pack behind. This dawn was like any he had seen before. For in reality, all the while, Limuson was trying to bring order out of the extraordinary thoughts and feelings that had possessed him during the slow forest ascent, and the task was not crowned with much success. The plan, made by others, had taken charge of him, he felt, and he had thrown the reins of personal will and interest loosely upon its steady gait. He had abandoned himself carelessly to what might come. Knowing that he was leader of the expedition, he yet had suffered the porter to go first, taking his own place, as it was appointed to him, behind the younger man, but before the priest. In this order they had plodded, as only experienced climbers plod, for hours without a rest, until halfway up a change had taken place. He had wished it, and instantly it was effected. The priest moved past him, while his companion dropped to the rear. The companion who forever stumbled in his speed, whereas the older man climbed surely, confidently. And thereafter Limuson walked more easily, as though the relative positions of the 3 were of importance somehow. The steep ascent of smothering darkness through the woods became less arduous. He was glad to have the younger man behind him, for the impression had strengthened as they climbed in silence that this ascent
pertained to some significant ceremony, and the idea had grown insistently, almost stealthily upon him. The movements of himself and his companions, especially the positions each occupied relative to the other, established some kind of intimacy that resembled speech, suggesting even question and answer. And the entire performance, while occupying hours by his watch, it seemed to him more than once had been in reality briefer than the flash of a passing thought, so that he saw it within himself pictorially. He thought of a picture working in colors upon a strip of elastic. Someone pulled the strip, and the picture stretched. Or someone released it again, and the picture flew back, reduced to a mere stationary speck. All happened in a single speck of time. And the little change of position, apparently so trivial, gave point to this singular notion working in his undermind, that this ascent was a ritual and a ceremony as in older days, its significant approaching revelation, however, for the first time, now. Without language this stole over him. No words could quite describe it, for it came to him that these three formed a unit, himself being in some fashion yet the acknowledged principal, the leader. The laboring porter had no place in it, for this first toiling through the darkness was a preparation, and when the actual climb began he would disappear, while Limuson himself went first. This idea that they took part together in a ceremony established itself firmly in him, with the added wonder that, though so often done, he performed it now for the first time with full comprehension, knowledge, truth. Empty of personal desire, indifferent to an ascent that formerly would have thrilled his heart with ambition and delight, he understood that climbing had ever been a ritual for his soul and of his soul, and that power must result from its sincere accomplishment. It was a symbolical ascent. In words this did not come to him. He felt it, never criticizing. That is, he neither rejected nor accepted. It stole most sweetly, grandly over him. It floated into him while he climbed, yet so convincingly that he had felt his relative position must be changed. The younger man held too prominent a post, or at least a wrong one, in advance. Then, after the change, effected mysteriously as though all recognized it, this line of certainty increased, and there came upon him the big strange knowledge that all of life is a ceremony on a giant scale, and that by performing the movements accurately, with sincere fidelity, there may come knowledge. There was a gravity in him from that moment. This ran in his mind with certainty. Though his thought assumed no form of little phrases, his brain yet furnished detailed statements that clinched the marvelous thing with simile and incident which daily life might apprehend. That knowledge arises from action, that to do the thing invites the teaching and explains it. Action, moreover, is symbolical. A group of men, a family, an entire nation, engaged in those daily movements which are the working out of their destiny, perform a ceremony which is in direct relation somewhere to the pattern of greater happenings, which are the teachings of the gods. Let the body imitate, reproduce, in a bedroom, in a wood, anywhere, the movements of the stars, and the meaning of those stars shall sink down into the heart. The movements constitute a script, a language. To mimic the gestures of a stranger is to understand his mood, his point of view. To establish a grave and solemn intimacy. Temples are everywhere, for the entire earth is a temple, and the body, house of royalty, is the biggest temple of them all. To ascertain the pattern its movements trace in daily life could be to determine the relation of that particular ceremony to the cosmos, and so learn power. The entire system of Pythagoras, he realized, could be taught without a single word, by movements, and in everyday life even the commonest act and vulgarest movement are part of some big ceremony, a message from the gods. Ceremony, in a word, is three-dimensional language, and action therefore is the language of the gods. The gods he had denied were speaking to him, passing with tumult close across his broken life. Their passage it was, indeed, that had caused the breaking. In this cryptic, condensed fashion the great fact came over him, that he and these other two, here and now, took part in some great ceremony of whose ultimate object as yet he was in ignorance. The impact with which it dropped upon his mind was tremendous. He realized it most fully when he stepped from the darkness of the forest and entered the expanse of glimmering early light. Up till this moment his mind was being prepared only,
whereas now he knew. The innate desire to worship which all along had been his, the momentum his religious temperament had acquired during 40 years, the yearning to have proof, in a word, that the gods he once acknowledged were really true, swept back upon him with that violent reaction which denial had aroused. He wavered where he stood. Looking about him then, while the others rearranged burdens, the returning porter now discarded, he perceived the astonishing beauty of the time and place, feeling it soak into him as by the very pores of his skin. From all sides this beauty rushed upon him. Some radiant, winged sense of wonder sped past him through the silent air. A thrill of ecstasy ran down every nerve. The hair of his head stood up. It was far from unfamiliar to him, this sight of the upper mountain world awakening from its sleep of the summer night. But never before had he stood shuddering thus at its exquisite cold glory, nor felt its significance as now, so mysteriously within himself. Some transcendent power that held sublimity was passing across this huge, desolate plateau, far more majestic than mere sunrise among mountains he had so often witnessed. There was movement. He understood why he had seen his companions insignificant. Again he shivered and looked about him, touched by a solemnity that held deep awe. Personal life indeed was wrecked, destroyed, but something greater was on the way. His fragile alliance with a spiritual world was strengthened. He realized his own past insolence. He became afraid. 3. The treeless plateau, littered with enormous boulders, stretched for miles to right and left, gray in the dusk of very early morning. Behind him dropped thick guardian pine woods into the sleeping valley that still detained the darkness of the night. Here and there lay patches of deep snow, gleaming faintly through thin rising mist. Singing streams of icy water spread everywhere among the stones, soaking the coarse rough grass that was the only sign of vegetation. No life was visible, nothing stirred, nor anywhere was movement, but of the quiet trailing mist and of his own breath that drifted past his face like smoke. Yet through the splendid stillness there was movement, that sense of absolute movement which results in stillness. It was owing to the stillness that he became aware of it, so vast on its surface, or great machinery turn with such vertiginous velocity that it appears steady to the deceived function of the eye. For it was not through the eye that this solemn movement made itself known, but rather through a massive sensation that owned his entire body as its organ. Within the league-long amphitheater of enormous peaks and precipices that enclosed the plateau, piling themselves upon the horizon, Limuson felt the outline of a ceremony extended. The pulses of its grandeur poured into him where he stood. Its vast design was knowable because they themselves had traced, were even then tracing, its earthly counterpart in little, and the awe in him increased.
"This light is false. We have an hour yet before the true dawn," he heard the younger man say lightly. "The summits still are ghostly. Let us enjoy the sensation and see what we can make of it."
And Lemuson, looking up startled from his reverie, saw that the faraway heights and towers indeed were heavy with shadow. Faint still with the light of stars, it seemed to him they bowed their awful heads, and that their stupendous shoulders lowered. They drew together, shutting out the world.
"True," said his companion, "and the upper snows still wear the spectral shine of night. But let us now move faster, for we travel very light. The sensations you propose will but delay and weaken us."
He handed a share of the burdens to his companion and to Limuson. Slowly they all moved forward, and the mountains shut them in. And two things Limuson noted then, as he shouldered his heavier pack and led the way. First, that he suddenly knew their destination, though its purpose still lay hidden. And secondly, that the porters leaving before the ascent proper began signified finally that the ordinary climbing was not their real objective. Also, the dawn was a lifting of inner veils from off his mind, rather than a brightening of the visible earth due to the nearing sun. Thick darkness indeed draped this enormous, lonely amphitheater where they moved.
"You lead us well,"
said the priest a few feet behind him, as he picked his way unfalteringly among the boulders and streams. "Strange that I do so," replied Limuson in a low tone, for the way is new to me, and the darkness grows instead of lessening." The language seemed hardly of his choosing. He spoke and walked as in a dream. Far in the rear, the voice of the younger man called plaintively after them.
"You go so fast, I can't keep up with you."
And again he stumbled and dropped his ice axe among the rocks. He seemed forever stooping to drink the icy water, or clambering off the trail to test the patches of snow as to quality and depth.
"You're missing all the excitement," he cried repeatedly. "There are 100 pleasures and sensations by the way."
They paused a moment for him to overtake them. He came up panting and exhausted, making remarks about the fading stars, the wind upon the heights, new routes he longed to try up dangerous couloirs, about everything, it seemed, except the work in hand. There was eagerness in him, the kind of excitement that saps energy and wastes the nervous force, threatening a probable collapse before the arduous object is attained.
"Keep to the thing in hand," replied the priest sternly. "We are not really going fast. It is you who are scattering yourself to no purpose. It wears us all. We must husband our resources."
And he pointed significantly to the pyramid of the Tour de Néant that gleamed above them at an incredible altitude.
"We are here to amuse ourselves. Life is a pleasure, a sensation, or it is nothing," grumbled his companion.
But there was a gravity in the tone of the older man that discouraged argument and made resistance difficult. The other arranged his pack for the 10th time, twisting his axe through an ingenious scheme of straps and string, and fell silently into line behind his leaders. Limuson moved on again, and the darkness at last began to lift. Far overhead at first, the snowy summits shone with a hue less spectral. A delicate pink spread softly from the east. There was a freshening of the chilly wind. Then suddenly the highest peak that topped the others by 1,000 feet of soaring rock stepped sharply into sight, half golden and half rose. At the same instant, the vast movement of the entire scene slowed down. There came 1 or 2 terrific gusts of wind in quick succession. A roar like an avalanche of falling stones boomed distantly, and Lemuson stopped dead and held his breath. For something blocked the way before him, something he knew he could not pass. Gigantic and unformed, it seemed part of the architecture of the desolate waste about him, while yet it bulked there, enormous in the trembling dawn, as belonging neither to plain nor mountain. Suddenly it was there, where a moment before had been mere emptiness of air. Its massive outline shifted into visibility as though it had risen from the ground. He stood stock still. A cold that was not of this world turned him rigid in his tracks. A few yards behind him the priest had halted too. Farther in the rear they heard the stumbling tread of the younger man, and the faint calling of his voice, a feeble broken sound as of a man whom sudden fear distressed to helplessness.
"We're off the track, and I've lost my way." The words came on still air. "My axe is gone. Let us put on the rope. Hark! Do you hear that roar?"
And then a sound as though he came slowly groping on his hands and knees.
"You have exhausted yourself too soon," the priest answered sternly. "Stay where you are and rest, for we go no farther. This is the place we sought."
There was in his tone a kind of ultimate solemnity that for a moment turned Lemuson's attention from the great obstacle that blocked his farther way. The darkness lifted veil by veil, not gradually, but by a series of leaps, as when someone inexpertly turns a wick. He perceived then that not a single grandeur loomed in front, but that others of similar kind, some huger than the first, stood all about him, forming an enclosing circle that hemmed him in. Then with a start he recovered himself. Equilibrium and common sense returned. The trick that sight had played upon him, assisted by the rarefied atmosphere of the heights and the witchery of dawn, was no uncommon one after all. The long straining of the eyes to pick the way in an uncertain light so easily deceives perspective. Delusion ever follows abrupt change of focus. These shadowy encircling forms were but the rampart of still, distant precipices, whose giant walls framed the tremendous amphitheater to the sky. Their closeness was a mere gesture of the dusk and distance. The shock of the discovery produced an instant's unsteadiness in him that brought bewilderment. He straightened up, raised his head, and looked about him. The cliffs, it seemed to him, shifted back instantly to their accustomed places. as though, after all, they had been close. There was a reeling among the topmost crags. They balanced fearfully, then stood still against a sky already faintly crimson. The roar he heard, that might well have seemed the tumult of their hurrying speed, was in reality but the wind of dawn that rushed against their ribs, beating the echoes out with angry wings, and the lines of trailing mist, streaking the air like proofs of rapid motion, merely coiled and floated in the empty spaces. He turned to the priest who had moved up beside him. "How strange," he said, "is this beginning of new light. My sight went all astray for a passing moment. I thought the mountains stood right across my path, and when I looked up just now it seemed they all ran back." His voice was small and lost in the great listening air. The man looked fixedly at him. He had removed his slouch hat, hot with the long ascent, and as he answered, a long thin shadow flitted across his features. A breath of darkness dropped about them. It was as though a mask were forming. The face that now was covered had been naked. He was so long in answering that Lemuson heard his mind sharpening the sentence like a pencil. He spoke very slowly. "They move, perhaps, even as their powers move, and their minutes are our years. Their passage ever is in tumult. There is disorder, then, among the affairs of men. There is confusion in their minds. There may be ruin and disaster, but out of the wreckage shall issue strong, fresh growth. For like a sea, they pass." There was in his mien a grandeur that seemed borrowed marvelously from the mountains. His voice was grave and deep. He made no sign or gesture, and in his manner was a curious steadiness that breathed through the language a kind of sacred prophecy. Long thundering gusts of wind passed distantly across the precipices as he spoke. The same moment, expecting apparently no rejoinder to his strange utterance, he stooped and began to unpack his knapsack. The change from this sacerdotal language to this commonplace and practical detail was singularly bewildering.
"It's the time to rest," he added, "and the time to eat. Let us prepare."
And he drew out several small packets and laid them in a row upon the ground. Awe deepened over Limuson as he watched, and with it a great wonder, too, for the words seemed ominous, as though this man upon the floor of some vast temple said, "Let us prepare a sacrifice." There flashed into him, out of depths that had hitherto concealed it, a lightning clue that hinted at explanation of the entire strange proceeding. Of the abrupt meeting with the strangers, the impulsive acceptance of their project for the great ascent, their grave behavior as though it were a ceremonial of immense design, his change of position, the bewildering tricks of sight, and the solemn language, finally, of the older man that corroborated what he himself had deemed at first illusion. In a flying second of time this all swept through him, and with it the sharp desire to turn aside, retreat, to run away. Noting the movement, or perhaps divining the emotion prompting it, the priest looked up quickly. In his tone was a coldness that seemed as though this scene of wintry desolation uttered words. "You have come too far to think of turning back. It is not possible. You stand now at the gates of birth and death. All that might hinder, you have so bravely cast aside. Be brave now to the end." And, as Lemuson heard the words, there dropped suddenly into him a new and awful insight into humanity, a power that unerringly discovered the spiritual necessities of others, and therefore of himself. With a shock he realized that the younger man who had accompanied them with increasing difficulty as they climbed higher and higher was but a shadow of reality. Like the porter, he was but an encumbrance who impeded progress, and he turned his eyes to search the desolate landscape. "You will not find him," said his companion, "for he is gone. Never, unless you weakly call, shall you see him again, nor desire to hear his voice." And Limuson realized that in his heart he had all the while disapproved of the man, disliked him for his theatrical fondness of sensation and effect. More, that he had even hated and despised him. Starvation might crawl upon him where he had fallen, and eat his life away before he would stir a finger to save him. It was with the older man he now had dreadful business in hand. "I am glad," he answered, "for in the end he must have proved my death. Our death. and they drew closer round the little circle of food the priest had laid upon the rocky ground, an intimate understanding linking them together in a sympathy that completed Lemuson's bewilderment. There was bread, he saw, and there was salt. There was also a little flask of deep red wine. In the center of the circle was a miniature fire of sticks the priest had collected from the bushes of wild rhododendron. The smoke rose upwards in a thin blue line. It did not even quiver, so profound was the surrounding stillness of the mountain air. But far away among the precipices ran the boom of falling water, and behind it again the muffled roar, as of peaks and snowfields that swept with a rolling thunder through the heavens.
"They are passing," the priest said in a low voice, "and they know that you are here. You have now the opportunity of a lifetime, for if you yield acceptance of your own free will, success is sure. You stand before the gates of birth and death. They offer you life."
"Yet I denied them," he murmured it below his breath.
"Denial is evocation. You called to them, and they have come. The sacrifice of your little personal life is all they ask. Be brave and yield it."
He took the bread as he spoke, and breaking it in 3 pieces, he placed one before Limuson, one before himself, and the third he laid upon the flame which first blackened and then consumed it.
"Eat it and understand," he said, "for it is the nourishment that shall revive your fading life."
Next, with the salt, he did the same. Then, raising the flask of wine, he put it to his lips, offering it afterwards to his companion. When both had drunk, there still remained the greater part of the contents. He lifted the vessel with both hands reverently towards the sky. He stood upright.
"The blood of your personal life I offer to them in your name. By the renunciation which seems to you as death, shall you pass through the gates of birth to the life of freedom beyond. For the ultimate sacrifice that they ask of you is this." And bending low before the distant heights, he poured the wine upon the rocky ground. For a period of time Lemuson found no means of measuring, so terrible were the emotions in his heart. The priest remained in this attitude of worship and obeisance. The tumult in the mountains ceased. An absolute hush dropped down upon the world. There seemed a pause in the inner history of the universe itself. All waited till he rose again. And when he did so, the mask that had for hours now been spreading across his features was accomplished. The eyes gazed sternly down into his own. Lemuson looked and recognized. He stood face to face with the man whom he knew best of all others in the world, himself. There had been death. There had also been that recovery of splendor which is birth and resurrection. And the sun that moment, with the sudden surprise that mountains only know, rushed clear above the heights, bathing the landscape and the standing figure with a stainless glory. Into the vast temple where he knelt, as into the greater inner temple which is mankind's true house of royalty, there poured the completing presence which is light. "For in this way and in this way only shall you pass from death to life," sang a chanting voice he recognized also now for the first time as indubitably his own. It was marvelous. But the birth of light is ever marvelous. It was anguish, but the pangs of resurrection since time began have been accomplished by the sweetness of fierce pain. For the majority still lie in the prenatal stage, unborn, unconscious of a definite spiritual existence. In the womb they grope and stifle, depending ever upon another. Denial is ever the call to life, a protest against continued darkness for deliverance. Yet birth is the ruin of all that has hitherto been depended on. There comes then that standing alone which at first seems desolate isolation. The tumult of destruction precedes release. Lemuson rose to his feet, stood with difficulty upright, looked about him from the figure so close now at his side to the snowy summit of that Tour du Néant he would never climb. The roar and thunder of their passage was resumed. It seemed the mountains reeled. "They are passing,"
sang the voice that was beside him and within him too.
"but they have known you, and your offering is accepted. When they come close upon the world, there is ever wreckage and disaster in the affairs of men. They bring disorder and confusion into the mind, a confusion that seems final, a disorder that seems to threaten death. For there is tumult in their presence, and apparent chaos that seems the abandonment of order. Out of this vast ruin, then, there issues life in new design. The dislocation is its entrance, the dishevelment its strength. There has been birth."
The sunlight dazzled his eyes. That distant roar, like a wind, came close and swept his face. An icy air as from a passing star breathed over him.
"Are you prepared?"
he heard. He knelt again. Without a sign of hesitation or reluctance, he bared his chest to the sun and wind. The flash came swiftly, instantly, descending into his heart with unerring aim. He saw the gleam in the air. He felt the fiery impact of the blow. He even saw the stream gush forth and sink into the rocky ground, far redder than the wine. He gasped for breath a moment, staggered, reeled, collapsed. And within the moment, so quickly did all happen, he was aware of hands that supported him and helped him to his feet. But he was too weak to stand. They carried him up to bed. The porter and the man who had reached across him for the matches 5 minutes before intended conversation stood one at his feet and the other at his head. As he passed through the vestibule of the hotel, he saw the people staring, and in his hand he crumpled up the unopened letters he had received so short a time ago. "I really think I can manage alone," he thanked them. "If you will set me down, I can walk. I felt dizzy for a moment."
"The heat in the hall,"
the gentleman began in a quiet, sympathetic voice. They left him standing on the stairs, watching a moment to see that he had quite recovered. Lemuson walked up the 2 flights to his room without faltering. The momentary dizziness had passed. He felt quite himself again, strong, confident, able to stand alone, able to move forward, able to climb.